And without measures to contain escalating drug costs, they are expected to grow and were expected to grow by 7% in 2010-11. And of course, we're almost through 2010 now. And that was, when I say grow, I mean grow to more than $300 million annually. Mr. Speaker, this is not sustainable, and for our government, it is also not acceptable. Mr. Speaker, drug costs now account for the fourth largest health care expenditure after hospitals, physicians, and continuing care. Now, of the drugs included in these escalating costs, Mr. Speaker, Lipitor accounts for the largest portion of government spending on drugs through pharmacare programs. Mr. Speaker, in 2009-10, the government spent $14.7 million on Lipitor through the various pharmacare programs. Atorvastatin, the generic form, became available in August and cost significantly less to Nova Scotians in pharmacare programs. However, because Nova Scotians pay more for generic drugs than people in many other provinces and indeed other countries, our government believed it could get a fairer and better price. Mr. Speaker, up to now, Nova Scotians enrolled in the Family Pharmacare Plan, taking the generic version of Lipitor, which I think everybody knows is commonly used to treat high cholesterol, paid $84.88 for a one-year prescription. Using Ontario's pricing strategy, Nova Scotians in Family Pharmacare would pay $46.88. Mr. Speaker, all 8 companies which submitted offers to provide atorvastatin were accepted, and contracts have been signed for 1 year from December 1st, 2010 to November 30th, 2011. As part of the agreement, the 8 companies will provide atorvastatin at 35% of the cost of Lipitor through pharmacare programs. Mr. Speaker, for the record, these companies and the provinces in which they are based are as follows: Sandoz, Quebec; Ranbaxy, Ontario; Teva, Ontario; GenMed, Quebec; Apotex, Ontario; Sanus, New Brunswick; Pharmascience, Ontario; and Cobalt, Ontario. Mr. Speaker, about 20,000 seniors will see savings of up to $145 on the annual cost of brand name Lipitor and $35 on the current price of the generic drug atorvastatin. Mr. Speaker, the new pricing takes effect on December 1st, 2010. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that as a result of these contracts and the generic drug having become available at 50% of the cost of the brand drug in August, government will have saved $4 million under pharmacare this fiscal year over last. $4 million. $4 million. Mr. Speaker, this arrangement has shown real leadership on behalf of the minister and on behalf of the government, and it's an example of our commitment to making health care affordable to all Nova Scotian families. Mr. Speaker, before the generic drug was available, a Nova Scotian senior paid more than $240 each year through senior pharmacare based on a prescription of 20 milligrams of Lipitor filled 4 times a year. Today, Mr. Speaker, that same senior pays close to $130 each year for the same prescription of atorvastatin. And as of December 1st, Mr. Speaker, and this is the best part, they will pay about $95 per year. Mr. Speaker, that's going from, if you were following my figures here, $240 annually to $95 annually. Mr. Speaker, that's a saving of $145. Mr. Speaker, that's good for Nova Scotia seniors. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, as previously stated, pay more for generic drugs than several other provinces and a number of other countries. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to changing that going forward. When we were elected, we told Nova Scotians we were committed to making health care better for seniors and families in every region of this province. Providing the generic form of Lipitor at a lower price is just one step we've taken to accomplish this goal. Mr. Speaker, we're working hard to ensure that Nova Scotians are able to afford the prescription drugs they need and that they get the health care that they need as well, and in a timely manner. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Finance has often stated, and as Nova Scotians already know, the province is in difficult financial circumstances right now, and there are demands to fund new, and I might add, expensive drugs. By actively working to lower the cost to Nova Scotia of generic drugs, our government is keeping the promise to make life more affordable for Nova Scotian families. Mr. Speaker, we are working toward establishing a drug management policy unit which will lead a number of initiatives to make prescription drugs more affordable and more accessible to Nova Scotia families. Our pledge, Mr. Speaker, is to continue this work with vigor as we move toward making health care better for everyone who lives in this province. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and with those few words, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise this evening in late debate to talk about our medical plans and our pharmacare and the cost of Lipitor and the savings to seniors and to the government. Mr. Speaker, it's clearly an avenue to talk about everything in health care when we have a resolution like this before us. The resolution is asking for us to congratulate the government on having savings in the drug Lipitor, but frankly, Mr. Speaker, as much as we're happy to see that, it was coming anyway. The drug finished its patent life, became once it was no longer protected as a patent, it would immediately be available to generic drug companies to manufacture at a cheaper cost. So we've been talking for over a year now in the legislature here about the savings that were coming to the province as a result of what's known as the patent cliff. And that is that there are a large number of very popular, frequently prescribed drugs that are coming to the end of their patent life, and that Lipitor, in fact, was the largest one of those drugs that the province prescribes, or doctors in our province prescribe. So it was a very, and is a very, very frequently used prescription drug that lowers cholesterol. So it happens to be many Nova Scotians are taking that drug. Many seniors who are on seniors pharmacare would be taking that drug. But Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that drug was headed to becoming a generic this year. It did become a generic, and the savings were recognized. So in terms of what the minister's done, the minister had gone to tender asking for lower drug prices if she could get them, and that is something that's different for our province, something that other provinces have tried, and I think I guess our Minister of Health decided it was time to give it a try here, and she's come back with 8 companies that can supply the drug Lipitor in its generic version to the province. And Mr. Speaker, we do worry about supply of drugs, and there's been a lot of changes in the pharmacies and the Pharmacies Acts and the work of pharmacists right across the country, and there is in fact a lot of instability and a lot of uncertainty surrounding this. So while we can celebrate the decrease in one drug that's coming back to us, and in fact look forward to others that through no work on the part of the minister will simply change from being a brand name to a generic name and available to us, there's more work to be done, Mr. Speaker. One thing is we need to ensure that doctors are actually going to be prescribing the generic version, or we need to ensure that pharmacists have the right to substitute on their own. Right now, it's my understanding that if you come in and you say, I don't have a drug plan, and your doctor's given you the brand name, the Lipitor prescription, the pharmacist has to actually speak to the doctor in order to switch it to a generic, to say, do you mind, this person doesn't have a drug plan and they need the lower price, and they can then go ahead and do that, but they need to have the doctor's permission. So what I'm suggesting is that somewhere in this government there should be a move made to, while we're looking at the scope of practice for pharmacists, that pharmacists be given the right to recognize when there's really essentially an identical drug, but it's a non-brand name drug, it's a generic drug, that they should have the right to substitute that drug and provide it without having to waste the time of the pharmacist or waste the time of the doctor either, who gets a phone call saying, do you mind, and has to take that call and so on. So there's an awful lot of time wasted between pharmacies and doctors' offices for any number of refills and prescription calls, and that's part of the new Pharmacy Act that's coming down. In fact, it's in second reading, I think now, or perhaps it's going going to law amendments. And it is an act to expand the scope of pharmacists so that we can have them playing a bigger role in the delivery of health care and really using all of their skills, because they know an awful lot more about drugs, in fact, and the interaction of drugs than doctors do, because that's what they study for their entire time at university. They are experts in drugs. And so we need to use them more fully, Mr. Speaker. One thing the Liberals have called for over a number of years, and in fact, almost the entire time that I've been a member, which is 7 years, was that we put in place a drug review for seniors that takes place every year. And Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to speak to somebody who works in geriatrics, in fact is a world-renowned researcher and doctor in the area of geriatrics, and he said it is amazing if you look at the drugs that people are on in nursing homes to see that they're taking drugs like Lipitor, which was exactly one of the drugs he mentioned, Mr. Speaker. Lipitor is intended to keep your cholesterol low when you're younger, when you're in your 40s and 50s and moving into older age. It keeps it low so that you don't suffer heart disease and develop heart disease and have many, many more complications and costs and perhaps lose your life as a result of heart disease. So it's a very important drug, but it's not intended for people who are 80 years old or 85 or 90 to continue to stay on it, because it's really intended for younger people to prevent heart disease in the long run. If you haven't developed heart disease and you're already in that older age group, you don't need it anymore. And yet this researcher said that is an example of drugs that we're prescribing and administering to seniors that they don't need. And it really needs to be reviewed. And Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to note that quite a number of years ago, Australia introduced a seniors drug review. That's an annual drug review conducted by pharmacists, because they understand the interaction of the drugs. And they actually looked at seniors and found, and I think recently here in Canada actually a study was done that said that the average senior takes between 5 and 10 drugs, I think is the average. It might even be 10 was the average number. But they're taking a lot of drugs, and they often get on a drug like Lipitor that they're assigned earlier on, maybe 20 years ago, and they just continue to take it. And there's no need, Mr. Speaker, but I wouldn't stop taking it unless I'd had a professional, a pharmacist or my doctor agree that it was time not to be on it. But a lot of seniors are on a cocktail of drugs, different drugs. They don't always interact well. Sometimes one negates another, or they create adverse side effects. Then they give you another drug for the side effects, and you end up on just a slew of drugs, Mr. Speaker. Our Department of Health, and in fact our government, could save so much money if they would institute a fee to pay pharmacists for this seniors drug review. Because just think of the enormous cost of the drugs that people are on. Sometimes a single drug is, hundreds of dollars per prescription. So if we could actually review the drugs they're on, you'd have seniors that are actually feeling better and healthier because they've been taken off drugs that had adverse reactions and interactions. And so they're on fewer drugs, and those drugs are really doing the things that are most necessary for them. As I say, when Australia instituted this, especially in the first couple of years, they found that they saved millions upon millions of dollars. And I know that the previous speaker, the member from Lunenburg West, spoke about He spoke about $4 million in savings, and that's what's going to come as a result of Lipitor becoming a generic drug and being tendered. And as I said, those savings we could have expected anyway, because it is the largest single prescription drug that's in use in Nova Scotia. And what I would like to see is that the government grab hold of this issue of seniors being on too many drugs and work with either the pharmacists or Doctors Nova Scotia. But I think that the appropriate place would be through the pharmacies to ask them to sit down with seniors once a year, look at the whole slew of drugs that they're on, and help them make sense out of what really is worthwhile staying on. And all of us know from our own family members, people that are assigned to take a drug and just continue to take it for years and years. So, I'm really suggesting today, and I think it's a worthwhile suggestion, I'm sure the members present will take it forward to government as well, that this is something that the Liberals have been asking for many years. It's happening in a haphazard way, if at all now, and even to begin with every single senior in a nursing home. ensuring that every single senior that lives in one of the nursing homes that are licensed and managed by companies but licensed by the province of Nova Scotia. We know where they are. We're subsidizing the cost of health and often the accommodation costs of people in those nursing homes. Let's look at their drug regimes and see whether we can't make tremendous savings right there. And that savings would go back into seniors' pharmacare, and it would go back into the pockets of the individuals who are paying the co-pays, and it would help the bottom line of the province of Nova Scotia. And I think that is in the interest of all of us, because I don't think anybody should sit in this legislature if they don't want to see Nova Scotia do better, have more money to meet the needs of the many important things that we have before us. And I would be remiss, I think I only have about a minute left, and I would certainly be remiss if I didn't mention that while we're putting a little bit more money into the pockets of seniors who may save as a result of Lipitor, we're also in a province where we just increased the HST by 2%, and that 2% is affecting every single service and every single product that seniors buy. And that is a tremendous cost that's on gasoline, and it's compounded on gasoline because this is a province with a tax on tax. So we've had even a greater impact on seniors when it comes to the cost of gas, the cost of insurance, the cost of everything that has provincial tax associated. So as I say, Mr. Speaker, this is not altogether a good news story for seniors this year in this with this government. In fact, it's a bad news story. The government likes to boast about a decrease in tax on home heating fuel, but in the time that they've been in government, there's been more than that amount added on for other charges, to pay for Efficiency Nova Scotia, to pay for fuel to pay for people lowering their demand for energy through Nova Scotia Power. All those fees have been approved and pushed through on our power bills in that length of time. They have more than eaten up the savings that came with a decrease in the provincial sales tax on home heating. And that, Mr. Speaker, was completely counterproductive. That tax across the board really didn't help the people who need it the most. And Mr. Speaker, I see that my time has elapsed, so I would simply like to say that it's been a pleasure to address the issue of Lipitor, and we look forward to all the other patented drugs that are about to become generic.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Good member, too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise tonight. I must give the government some credit. They've reduced the costs of the of generic drugs by using generic drugs, and we have to give them credit for that.
Gary did it.
But, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a point that in the resolution there's a lot of credit being given to themselves for something that's good here, but I think we need to look at the bigger picture issue. Where are we going as a province? And yes, we're getting drugs cheaper, and that's great. It is, as the honourable member mentioned, it is the fourth cost item in the budget line for the Department of Health, so it is significant. But let's not start patting ourselves in the back too quickly here, Mr. Speaker. If we look at health, which is the biggest department in government, last year it grew at a rate of almost 8%. It was about 7.9% rate of growth. And that may be okay if our revenues for the province are also growing at the same rate, but they're not. If we look, we have a population that's in decline. A good portion of our productivity, our GDP, in fact, about 29% of our GDP is government spending. So almost 1/3 of our economy is government spending. Whereas if we look in other provinces, we see numbers closer to 20%. So those economies are stronger because there's a larger private sector. And the other thing that we have that's working against us is we have an aging population. And in 2020, 1/3 of Nova Scotians will be seniors. So these are people that are going to need social services from government. They're not going to be able to contribute further to our economy because they're going to be retired. And we have a small private sector here, as I just mentioned, Mr. Speaker. But it's the private sector that drives innovation and growth in economies and that creates jobs. Unfortunately, our private sector is small. Now, Mr. Speaker, this government will throw back at me, and they've done it in the past. If we look at the rate of growth in health care, and they'll say, well, Alan, where would you cut? You know, and I remember during estimates last year, the Honourable Minister of Finance had went so far as to suggest where would he cut in Inverness, almost in a threatening tone. And I thought that was unfortunate. But Mr. Speaker, I think there comes times in this House when we have to ask ourselves if we've come here for the betterment of the province, or are we coming here for ourselves? And I believe, and I have to believe this, otherwise I wouldn't be here, that I'm here for the betterment of the province. And I do believe that it is time for government to get its costs under control. And I think of a university student I spoke with out on the step today when I was here earlier. I had a constituent, Jerome Tracy, who was given a medal for bravery today. And very nice to see him here and his family. And when I left the House, I spoke with this university student who was asking me about, well, what do you think about the cost of tuition? And like so many other things in government, everything is going up. The cost of everything is going up. And I told him, I said, well, you know, I said, if you want to get to the root of the problem, I think we have to look at finding some way to reward universities to reduce their costs. And we have to make it more affordable that way. If we just give subsidies and if we give tax credits, we're only dulling the effect of the cost increase. We're almost hiding it. And we're not giving an incentive for universities to reduce their costs. So we're not getting to the root of the problem. And much is the same in the case of healthcare and really government as a whole. And today we saw a company in the province, Larson's, close its doors. 300 people out of work. And the government can say, well, you know, it's not the HST increase that was made earlier this year. It's not the increases to income taxes. It's not the deficits that have been running up. And maybe they're right. Maybe those actions have not had an effect on Larson's. But, Mr. Speaker, I think if we keep going in the direction that we're going with deficit budgets and high taxes, it's certainly not going to help. And we have to ask ourselves if the only jobs in this province left that are safe are government jobs, is that a good thing? So, and then we would have to ask ourselves the question, well, if government jobs is the focus of our economy in Nova Scotia, who's going to pay the taxes to pay for those jobs? Well, sure, people in government are paying taxes like everybody else, but if you were looking at an average tax rate of 30%, you'd be looking at a need of about 3.33 jobs to pay for one government job. If you took out the one government job, you're down to 2.33 jobs needed from the private sector. And in Nova Scotia, we have a ratio of about 4 to 1. So we're ahead of the game. But wouldn't it be better, Mr. Speaker, if we were ahead of the game with 7 to 8 jobs for every government job? Wouldn't our economy be that much stronger? But, Mr. Speaker, we're not going to get there if we continue to let the costs of government rise and we are forced to increase taxes to cover off deficit budgets. And if there's one thing for sure, Mr. Speaker, in that small example, it's that we can't grow our economy with government jobs. And if we look at the actions of this government, they're today patting themselves on the back about this action to bring in generic drugs to reduce the costs, and that's good. But the main cost in government, all across government, are jobs and our salaries. And this government, from what I've seen, is they're trying to reduce the size of government by 10%, but they're saying they're going to do that just through attrition. It's going to happen on its own. But they've also given, from what I've seen, about a 90% job security to government, to everybody that works in government. And, Mr. Speaker, nobody likes to see jobs leave the economy. And I'm sure the people in Inverness, there's lots of people working in Inverness that work in government. But I can say this, that many of the jobs in government are located in Halifax. And if we want to do something significant, something meaningful, if we're serious about turning this ship around, we have to look at the cost of salaries in government. It's either that or we have to get people more healthy in this province. And I have a couple of statistics here. 9 million Canadians have at least one chronic health condition. And, you know, the demand for the service is very high for health care. And that's no doubt driving the costs. But I don't think we can afford to supply that demand when we have a rate of growth of 8%. And if you look at, if you're at a rate of growth of 7%, you're going to double every 10 years, no matter what you're talking about, whether it's money or whether it's the size of something. If you're growing at a rate of over 7% a year, you're going to double in size. And if our revenues aren't growing, we're not going to be able to handle that. And we're going to experience a lot of pain in other departments, in areas like education, in areas like infrastructure. People in rural Nova Scotia are very concerned about roads. That's always an important issue. So, and I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that this takes leadership, and I've not seen it from this government. And if we look in their history, we only need to look at their record of voting. When Premier Ham was trying to turn the ship around, like he did in 2002 and 2003, with the first balanced budget in 40 years, it was voted against by the NDP members in this House. And they talk about the mess that they were left with, but in fact, they were left with 8 balanced budgets. And the decisions that had to be made at that time were not always popular, but they put us in a better position today. And I can only think of what position we'd be in today if we hadn't taken that action. So those actions are really good, Mr. Speaker, and they require leadership. And I believe that they're in the best interest of our province. So, and I would also say, Mr. Speaker, the NDP government here has many voters in Halifax, and a lot of the seats in the 80s, when a lot of the spending was going on, were held by the electorate in Halifax. So before criticizing too much past governments, they should recognize that the people that are electing them are also voting for those governments. So, Mr. Speaker, to summarize, should government be patting themselves on the back for this? And I've seen advertising where they have been trying to do that, and I think they're just distracting from the true issue at hand, which is the fact that they're not gaining a real control of the costs of government. And it's important that we celebrate success, but we must be focused on the task at hand and making a difference for Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I do have further remarks here, but perhaps on a future date I'll have an opportunity to deliver them. And I will conclude my remarks with that. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all the members for their participation in the late debate tonight. That ends the day's business. The host shall now rise and meet again tomorrow from the hours of 2 o'clock till 6 o'clock.